everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today in this video, I'm going to be explaining you a very important topic which is key to building and especially connecting different software applications together in the software world. So the topic is about application programming interface. I'm going to be covering some of the key terminologies of APIs, the different types of APIs available which actually help us to connect different applications, how we send how the responses are received and the requests are sent, the entire process of that, some of the different types of APIs which are available, the key features of REST APIs and how they are different from SOAP APIs and the others, and also we'll be covering about Flask versus Fast API, which has become a very prominent Python framework, and especially when you're coding or programming developing softwares in Python, you must have come across Flask and Fast APIs. So I'm going to be covering the key differences between them and some of the features of APIs in general, along with the HTTP methods which are actually available. So let's begin. So when we talk about application, API stands for application programming interface. So when we talk about what is exactly an API, when you consider in the software world, you're actually building different software products, the front end and the back end. But have you ever thought that what based on what rules or protocols are these different software applications actually communicating with each other or actually connecting? So you must have heard about various terms like API integration. Even when you're using, when you're talking in terms of Python programming, then you we'll be hearing terms like model deployment. You're deploying your model on a particular API. You're serving the model on a particular API, or when you're building an application, you're containerizing it, right? You're containerizing the API and then deploying it on an API. You're containerizing the application. So, what exactly is this all about? Why are we actually integrating different APIs, and why is it necessary? So, the definition of an API is it is a set of rules and protocols that allows different software applications to communicate and interact with each other. APIs enables developer to access the functionality of another software system such as operating system, library or service without having to understand the internal details of how that system works. So this, can be analogous to a waiter, as you might be hearing across various resources. You might have come across that API can be thought of as a waiter, and then when you have a guest or customer who can be thought of as a client. So think it of as in the in a restaurant. When you go to a restaurant system, you have the client, which is a customer, and then you have the cook, which is a server, and then between the two, that is a client and the server, you need some kind of connection, right? Because some kind of communication or data transfer. So similarly, that is served by the waiter. So the waiter is not knowing what exactly the cook is doing, what the food recipe is all about, the internal working. Similarly, in the software development world, when we talk about client and a server, so when we say that the client is sending a request to the server. Now, this request can be in any form. The request can be to either just fetch the data from the server, or just return some particular kind of a message in some format, some acceptable format, which can be specified by the client to the server. Or it can also be the client wants to actually update or even create some resource and send that to the server, and it is expecting a response from the server, right? When you are sending a request, the client sends a request to the server has to respond to the client's request. So the communication between the two, that is the client and the server, has to be done with some a medium, and that interface to connect the two is application programming interface. I hope that I have made that clear. But what exactly is API? It is nothing but a set of rules and protocols which are actually allowing these software applications to actually interact with each other, two software applications, but without actually knowing what the other software application is all about, the internal working of the application. So we can say that APIs have this particular feature of abstraction also. When you talk about in terms of object-oriented programming, this is a very crucial topic in OOPS, like abstraction. So when we talk about abstraction, that is without knowing the hidden details of anything, or without knowing the hidden details of any application, the internal working of implementation details of the application, these APIs are serving as the functionality between the two. So various types of APIs also exist, and the most important being the REST API that we are using REST APIs, especially when you're building your personal projects or you work on building simple web apps. That is where the REST APIs you're actually using mostly. So REST stands for Representation State Transfer. Then you also have on the enterprise level. When I say enterprise level, it's a more complex form. So for organizations and or for which use complex instead of actually building on simple apps, when you have complex datas and the validations required, then you use SOAP, which stands for Simple Object Access Protocol API. API is Application Programming Interface. Then you also have the Fast API. Sorry, this is Fast API, and then you have the Flask as well, right? So I'm going to like focus more on the REST API being most popular over here. So I'm going to be taking the reference of REST API. I'm going to be explaining you the different HTTP methods, what exactly is JSON, what is XML, something introduction to that, so that because you can be familiar with this, because API serves a very important role in, be it in any software you're using, even and also in any programming language, even Python. When you're actually building or developing softwares, you need to have the knowledge of APIs. So that is why I've decided to make this introductory video to cover all the terminologies of API, and also will be giving few insights on the same. So, coming forward to the next, API method calls and HTTP are closely related. So, when I talked about, HTTP and API, but they are not the same. People actually confuse between HTTP and API method calls. They are closely related. HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol, right? It's commonly used as the underlying protocol. Protocol is a set of rules for communication. So, this REST API methods are using a set of protocols, and they can use any set of protocols, right? You must have heard about another set of protocols, which is file transfer protocol, right? File transfer protocols for sending files across different systems. Or you must have heard about a different another protocol like SMTP protocol, right? Simple mail transfer protocol, which is SMTP. Or this is a HTTP, which is very common. So that is hypertext transfer protocol. So this is most commonly used as the underlying protocol or the rule set of rules for making API calls and exchanging data between the clients and the servers. So see, I've already told you the communication between the client and the server has to be done through an API, and that API is governed by a set of protocols, which is HTTP or hypertext transfer protocols. Now, request response model is very important, since I've already given you an example, of a waiter serving food to the client, which is the customer, and he's taking the food from the server, which is the cook, right? You can think it off like that. So request response model, how do you think exactly is the request being generated, in what data format? Is it only in JSON, or is it in XML, or in, what exactly is the data format which is accepted by different APIs? So it depends on the API firstly. And when making an API call, the client, usually an application or a developer, which is the user side, right? When you are actually visiting any application, you come across different kinds of errors, which says either the server error or the client error. When you see that it is some 404 error, which is very common, right? 404 error, or you see something starting with 4, that says that there is something wrong at your end, or with your, as in the client's end. But when you see something starting, an error code starting with 5, it says 502 or something, which says internal server error. So there is something wrong or malfunctioning at the server side, but everything was going smoothly in the client side. So that is some, HTTP status codes are some means of representing the what message, right? Representing the message to the client as to what is the status of the call between the API call. So it sends an HTTP request to the server, usually to the API. The request contains information such as the HTTP method. So as I've already told you, the when the client or the customer gives an order to the waiter about the food, he just not just mentions the food. Definitely, he can just mention the food, but he can also mention what exactly he wants. So the more you specify something like more details about the food, something he might say that he wants something spices to be added, extra spicy, or something like less spicy, or more sugar to be added, and so on, the features of it, right? He's actually describing more about what he wants. So similarly, when the client is sending or passing an information, is sending an HTTP request to the server, and that can also contain information such as a HTTP method. This is very important, and HTTP method should be passed in. Now, the types of HTTP method, this is really very important in terms of software developments, especially when you're building any web applications. And I am sure that you must have come across these terms: get, post, put, delete. There are many more. Patch is also there. So get, post, put, delete. These are different HTTP methods. So what are these methods, and what exactly they stand for? They are just enlisted over here. I'm going to delve into them, but you just remember that we are operating on these methods. The endpoint URL is also going to be passed in by the client in the request body. What is this endpoint URL? We'll, again, I'll dive deeper into it in this video. Then headers, Sometimes a request body. Body is something, defining what the client exactly wants in the request with additional data. Data can either be metadata, data about the data, can be any additional data. HTTP methods. So APIs typically utilize different HTTP methods to perform different actions. And get, as I told, is for retrieving the data, right? So when the client wants to just fetch the data or retrieve the data or resources from the server, that is where it's going to pass in a HTTP method called as get HTTP method. Now coming to the next HTTP method, which is post. Post means sending data to the server to create new resources. So when I was talking about creation in the software, this actually you can think it of as CRUD operations. If you've heard of that, CRUD. Now C stands for create, R for read, U for update, and D for delete. This is very analogous to that. So get HTTP method is actually performing the read operation because it is retrieving the data or the resource in the server. It's performing the read operation. On the other hand, post is performing it's performing the create operation because it's sending the data to the server to create new resources. So when you're actually creating new resources, when I say creating new resources, it can either be, you can think it of any web application. Just imagine a web application which is a book adding application in a database. So when the client sends and makes an API call and just asks the server to send back the first book or send a particular name of the book, then that is a get request which is going to be passed in, just fetching data from the database. Post is going to send data and also going to add a new book into the list, all right, into the database. So when the client is actually entering his new book into the system of books, which is a books data set database. So that is where post HTTP method is going to be passed. Put is when update happens. So this is very very common when you talk in terms of database. So if you all heard of terms like database management system and the different operations we do, these come very handy there because in any operation of database, we actually perform create, read, update, delete. These are the standard operations, I would say. So when you talk about put, it updates existing resources with new data. Now there I was also talking about patch, right? Patch HTTP method. The difference between put, now put is more common. So it's for updating the entire resource completely with the new data. But patch on the other hand partially modifies. So for partial modification or change with the new data, you're going ahead with patch HTTP method. But you want to actually update existing resources with the new data, you go ahead with the put method. Delete, on the other hand, removes resources from the server. These methods define the intention of the API call and the desired operation to be performed on the server. Right. So that is why you're passing when the client in the request body, it also passes along with the request, it passes this delete HTTP method. That was all about the different HTTP methods which this API calls are also passing in along with them. Then this is just I just attached few fast API snapshots from a local project. So we can just say this is sample. This is something like different APIs there. So definitely REST API will be something different, and Flask will have a different user interface, right? You can have a different UI UX, which is user interface and user experience. So Fast API is a very modern Python web framework. You may or may not have heard of it, but you might have heard of Flask. I'm pretty sure of that. So when you heard of terms like API, so this is, I just want to show you a demo of how API looks. So it has this Fast API where it's having the option of get and post. So get is for fetching the information or resources from the server. So when you have this get data, it's asking for parameters. You can actually pass in any parameters or not. So if you just click on execute over here and using this curl command, something called as curl command. Curl is a command or similar. You can also use Postman if you've heard of Postman API, Postman tool, that which is actually used for testing the, you can say the testing the functionality of your built web app or the developed web app. So that is why you can use, or you can play around with the data. So we pass in the parameters here, and then this will run on a particular local host. If you have not deployed it, of course, on the public cloud, but on the local host is running. So when you have this is the interface of the get API, get HTTP method, and this is for the post where you're, over here it's asking again same thing, which is parameters have to be passed and the request body. So there is a request which is sent by the client. So if you see, the request is sent in the JSON format. Now this is a JSON format. When I was talking in terms of what data formats, remember in my start of the video, that is where JSON comes over here. So JSON is very popular kind of a data format where data is delivered or data gets transferred between the different the client and the server. So it's a very popular data format of communication, I can say. So JSON is JavaScript object notation, which is JSON. So JavaScript object notation is it's something like key value pair. Okay, so if you can see here, there is a key followed by a colon and then a value. Right, so content over here is the key and then yellow is a value. So if you've heard of data structures, you must have heard of hash map data structure, right? So if you have something as a key and a value pair, that is where something similar to JSON. And remember, the data should be enclosed in curly braces. So as you can see here, the request body. Um, it is enclosed in curly braces. And if you have a list, definitely the value need not be just one word string or a number. It can even be a list. But if it's a list, it has to be definitely enclosed in square brackets, as you can see here. Comments, color, noun, it's enclosed in square brackets. So JSON format is going to be passed here as request. So Fast API allows JSON format for the request body. Right. Now, what about the REST API? And what about the other APIs? Did I talk about that? So that will be the later part of the video. So there are different data formats. So another data format is XML, which is extensible markup language, and then you also have other data formats, right? Like HTML, which is like hypertext markup language, is another data format. So this is again, this is just I wanted to show you the response body. So once you pass in this request, the clients ask pass sending this request, how is the response going to be received or sent by the the server to the client? It is going to be done definitely by an API, which we are just seeing over here. This is the fast API, which is doing that in the backend. So when you see that code and the details, 200 stands for successful code, right? When you see that it says a status success, so this indicates that a successful status code. So the response is received by the client side, right? On the client side, you can see the response body hello followed by world, and then it says successful response. The type of the response is also mentioned here, which is string, because you see here all its key value pair JSON, but when you actually stringify it, or when you're converting a JSON object back to a string, that is called stringification or stringify. And when you want to JSONify, or when you want to convert a string object back to a JSON object, this JavaScript object notation, that is called as JSONify. So you can do that. Definitely a string can be converted to JSON and vice versa. So here we are returning the response in the string form. Now coming to the famous API terminologies, which I would like to cover something cover in depth also. You have to be familiar with these terms when you're talking in terms of API. Already you now must be already being acquainted with HTTP methods, what are different APIs, use of APIs, different types of APIs, and the data formats which are available. Let's delve into the API terminologies which we saw earlier, which is endpoint URL. Now, what is this endpoint? API call specifies a specific endpoint URL that corresponds to a particular resource or functionality exposed by the API. The URL typically follows a specific pattern or convention defined by the API provider. Now, this is very important. Now, endpoint URL. So basically, any API call, when you're making an API call, it has a particular endpoint. And when we need this particular endpoint in order to further deploy the application into production, right, from the local to the production level, or even if you are sending from the client is making a request to the server, it needs particular API endpoint. Now, this is a particular resource or functionality exposed by the API, and it is also it follows a certain convention. Headers, on the other hand, what is the header? So when you talk about a header, HTTP headers provide additional information about the request, such as content type, authorization, caching preferences. Now see, there are certain APIs which do not allow caching, prefer caching, and some which have caching abilities, right? Like if you say Fast API does provide caching abilities, and even REST API has cache preferences. On the other hand, SOAP may not allow cache preferences, right? So if you have consider authorization, there are some APIs which actually pass in information about the request. They also pass an authorization. Authorization is related to security aspect, right? You're authorizing a user, especially for the login purpose of any web app. You're actually authorizing the user or the client. So that is authorization. So some HTTP headers, the HTTP requests contain headers as well, and headers contain all these information, which is the type of the content, authorization, caching preferences. They can be used to pass authentication tokens. If you've heard of JWT, right, JavaScript web tokens, they might contain different types of authentication tokens, specify the format of the response, or control caching behavior. So if you want or you don't want caching, or you want a particular format of the response to be returned, you can specify that also in the header itself. So if you only want JSON to be returned, you can specify as JSON in the header, and so on. Request body. Some API calls may include request body that contains data to be sent to the server, and the request body can be of any type, which is JSON, XML, form data, right? So you can think it as a form that a user is actually he landed up a landing page or a web application, and there is a form. He has to enter his name, phone number, contact details, and so on. And there is a button. There is a button to submit. Now, when the action is triggered, or when the user is actually clicking on the submit button, it is when an action is going, an event is going to be triggered, right? And we also have event handlers inside. And now it depends, it is going a little deeper. So I might need a separate video to explain you about what is event handler and how exactly the event is triggered, what are action events, the different kinds of events. And if you talk in terms of web development, we have something called as React hooks, then the event handlers, components, controllers, and so on. But this is just an example when the user is clicking the submit button and event is going to be triggered, right? That is a submit and an action. Now, once that is done, the particular kind of this has also been seen by the API, and this is going to be communicated to the server, and then the server will generate a response in response to the action or to the event. So this is why there are various formats, which is JSON, XML, or form data. So form data can also be considered as one kind of a format for communication. Coming to server processing. So basically, to explain this particularly, it will be good if I can explain you in terms of actual demonstration. So maybe in the next few videos you will actually get to see about how the different form data is there, something more about the different software development, the interaction and the communication. Server processing. Upon receiving the API request, the server processes the request, performs required operations, and generates HTTP responses. As you have just seen in the I've just attached my screenshot over here, where successful response is shown as 200. Now, a status code is sent by the server. Now, the status code over here is 200, which indicates a successful. If it was something starting with 3, it means it's a redirection. Something to do with redirection error status code. And if it starts with 400, 400 to 405 and so on, it means it's a client side error. And a code, HTTP status code, which starts with 5, something to do with 5xx, or 5 starting with 5. It can either be 501, 502, and so on. That means it's a server side error. So these are some of the HTTP status codes which you should be familiar with, and because this is how the server is actually communicating with the client. So response codes, coming to the response codes which I'm talking about, the server sends an HTTP response back to the client, and I've already covered it can be the successful for 200 indicating success, 500 for server error, 404 for not found error, right? And along with the response body containing the requested data or any error messages. Response body carries the data or information requested by the client. It can be in different formats: JSON, XML, HTML, or plain text, depending on the API. As I've already told you, it highly depends on the API. See, SOAP API, it only is highly based on the XML format, right, which is extensible markup language, and it can also handle HTTP, which is HTML format as well, or the XML format. But on the other hand, REST API only dwells upon the JSON and XML format, right? So it can only handle some JSON, which is JavaScript object notation format, to the data transfer. So it depends highly on the API. So as we have just seen over here, Fast API, it was sending and receiving the data in JSON format, key value pair. So it highly depends on what API you are using, and this will also give you a clear picture of which API to go with and under which scenario. So depending on the content negotiation between the client and the server. Features of REST API, which is very common API. So I will just skim through the features because these are self-exploratory in nature. So I would like to just cover this. Uniform interface. So REST APIs follow uniform interface. It defines a set of constraints for consistent communication. It includes standard HTTP methods, as I've already explained. Cover all the different HTTP methods like get, post, put, patch, delete. well-defined media types like JSON and XML. So these JSON or XML are the ones for which REST API actually based on for media types for representing data. So data transfer, data representation can be done either in JSON or XML in REST API. Whereas in SOAP API, it's using XML or HTTP, right? Is XML or HTML, and hypermedia links to navigate between related resources. Stateless operations. Now, this is very important again. In just short, I'd like to say to you that REST API is stateless, whereas SOAP API is stateful. Right now, if I say it can either be stateful or stateless, SOAP API, it depends on you can make it stateless as well. You can make it stateful as well. So, but REST API is always stateless. So when we say each request to a REST API should contain all the necessary information to be processed independently, stateless means that the API does not remember, it does not remember the previous data. That is called as stateless. It can also be considered to be very forgetful, right? Forgetful. But if you're talking in terms of the memory, so it does not remember anything about the client, what the client has sent. Client has sent some information to the, sent some request to the server. It does not actually store or save that information or data. That is why it's called as stateless operation. There is no saving of the data. Server does not store any client-specific context or state between requests. Response codes, REST APIs use HTTP status codes to indicate the outcome of a request. Like I've already explained you what these status codes, different status codes stand for. Stateless, REST APIs is stateless, meaning that each request from the client to the server contains all the information needed to understand and process the request. The server does not store any client state between the requests, and that's why it simplifies scalability and allows better caching and load balancing. These are different terms, caching and load balancing. Like if you've heard of cache memory, it's just the faster memory, right? It is like to make your speed up your data retrieval. That is where caching is also saving the data. And load balancing, it's just you can think it of as to distribute the traffic when you are having different servers in order to distribute traffic, incoming traffic among the different servers, and to balance that, to orchestrate that. That is why comes the term load balancing. You have different, if you talk in terms of software development, there are again different terms in terms of DevOps, and different tools available for load balancing, data orchestration, and so on. Coming then to the features, stateless. REST APIs are stateless, meaning that each request from the client to the server contains all the information needed to understand. So I think I've just covered this right now. Then resource-based. REST APIs are built around resources which are identified by unique URIs. Now, what is URI? URI is Uniform Resource Identifier. URI is Uniform Resource Identifier. It's a subset of URL. Okay, so URL, you've heard of that. So you think URL is a link, right? So URL is Uniform Resource Locator. And URI. So which is URI on the other hand is Uniform Resource Identifier, and resources represent entities or objects in the system being exposed through the API. Clients interact with these resources by making requests to their corresponding URIs. Self-explanatory, and I've already covered these CRUD operations which are supported by REST APIs, which are get, post, put, and delete, and what they actually do or their functionalities, which is very important. This is finally to give you this is the final slide of my video, which is going to give you how exactly endpoints look like, how we actually pass in, get, and the post methods, and so on. So this is one of this is one of my projects in Python, because I've used over here Fast API. You could definitely use Flask as well. That's more familiar, but this is to show you exactly how asynchronous action is going to happen. That's why I've used demonstrate and attach the picture of Fast API over here, because the speciality of Fast API, which I'd like to introduce you, is that Fast API, although it's modern, Python web framework, which is very it is more secure than Flask, has many more operations, it is faster than Flask, but the most important thing is what makes it fast. It is actually based on ASGI, which is asynchronous server gateway interface. On the other hand, Flask uses WSGI, which is web server gateway interface. That is why it differentiates between the two. Now, asynchronicity, which is to make asynchronous calls together, to handle asynchronous processes. That is, it does not have to wait for previous request to finish or previous process to finish. The process of concurrency, multi-threading, that everything is supported in Fast API. That is what is a speciality in Fast API. It follows the ASGI, which is asynchronous asynchronous server gateway interface. So if you see this, that is imported in Python. This is, by the way, in VS Code. So I'm imported the Fast API from Fast API, import Fast API, and then we also Fast API has certain components, subcomponents like Pydantic for from the Pydantic I'm importing the base model. So Pydantic is for data validation, by the way. So Fast API, unlike Flask, And unlike other web frameworks, which actually need some external plugin for their web documentation and testing, Fast API makes it very easy because it's a complete full stack web framework. I would say it also has its it's based on Open API specification, as I've already attached a screenshot. If you see this Fast API, you did not even build this UI. It already has its own inbuilt UI, which is based on Swagger UI. Okay, so Swagger UI, which is again based on Swagger UI. So it was Open API, actually Open API specification, which was initially called as the Swagger UI. So this is based on Open API specification. Both are the same. So if you see this Fast API, because of that feature that is well documented, has its own built-in documentation. It's also more secure and it is faster because of the asynchronous properties. It uses the async library in Python. Because of such such aspects and features of Fast API, it has gained momentum. And although it has a small community because it's recent than Flask, but you can have a give it a try to actually build web applications. But if you are a beginner, then I would say that you can go with Flask. It's more easier and simpler to study. It's also a lightweight web framework. Flask is a mini Python framework. Okay, it's a mini framework in Python, web framework for building web applications and for making APIs. Then generating objects is just object-oriented programming I've used here. Starting the app, this is important. I'm instantiating the app like this. So if you're familiar with React.js also, we have something called as instantiating the app, right? You use app equal to and pass, passing this function, be it any something called as a functional component over there. So in this, we have this inbuilt method, which is Fast API method. I'm assigning that to app because I'm instantiating it, right? I'm starting the app. So then app test. So basically, this is an endpoint. What I'm talking about here, it has now Fast API has annotations, right? Okay, it has data validation and it also has two components, which is Starlet and Pydantic. So they're used for data validation, data serialization. So app.get, I'm passing in the get method, get request over here, HTTP method. I'm passing and the parameter, not passing in any parameter. So this can be considered as a root directory or just home. So async. Now every time I'm using, if you see here, passing in different functions, all the functions cannot operate together, right? You need some asynchronicity. Or so because of that, I'm using async over here, which uses the async library in Python. So that is why it's based on ASGI, which is asynchronous server gateway interface. So async def main, this is for defining the main function. It returns test and pass a key value pair in JSON format. Then again, for the post method, I'm defining a function which is text message, passing in a parameter text, which is in the string format. See, this is the way we are actually specifying. This is the header, we can say, because it specifies the type or the type of the content or the parameter. So it specifies over here text str, which is passed as argument to this text message function, the input. JSON compatible item. So this is to encode, or this any method you can use here. This is just the functionality which is inside the method, body of the method, returning JSON response. So I'm returning the response as JSON, and that is the post method. And this is post request. So if you see over here, content text, this is again for the this is the boilerplate, I would say, boilerplate code for Fast API. You can definitely go ahead over to the Fast API documentation, and you can have a look at the different methods supported, because they have a community, especially their documentation is really good, so you can refer that. And if you want to actually a beginner in Python, go ahead with Flask, and it also has a boilerplate code for you to actually initialize the app or start the app, then pass in different the different requests for the client side. You can actually make methods like the main method and pass in the get request, post request, and then you can test out for yourself. So for Fast API, since I'm demonstrating here, base model is the one which we have imported from Pydantic, and this is for data validation. Now, class text, I'm passing in base model, and content str, because you're returning the the content. Then app dot post, at the rate app dot post. Now at the rate over here you see in Python, if you're not familiar in Python. So this is just for information. This is called as a decorator. Okay, so it's called a decorator, and it's especially related to the structuring part of thing in Python, in Python. Oops. So app dot post, question answering, you're passing this parameter. Async, again you're defining a sync. Def post item text, then you're just returning as a key value pair, which is a JSON format. Similarly, post method, you're passing in the parameter, defining a function post item, and then just calling in this object QA or Gen QA and Gen Word. They're just inbuilt functions, or they're not inbuilt functions, but they're user defined functions, which I had created in my project. So instead of this functionality functions, you can just pass in any built-in function or your user-defined function also to just test the working or application of the test the working of the web application, the predicted textures, and it's going to return the text over here. So that was all about how we pass in content using Fast API, how to make requests in Fast API. This is a boilerplate code you can refer to, and I hope I have covered API terminologies, given a vast overview about all about how software development is actually taking place with the help of different APIs, and that was all about it from my side. Do stay tuned on my YouTube channel. Like, share, and subscribe my videos with your friends and with your acquaintances to help them to uncover different CSE aspects and to gain more knowledge on CSE. I hope you like my video. Thank you.